Here's the thing. When director Christopher Storer called action for the first time on the set of The Bear, everything turned into pure chaos. Actors screaming, overlapping dialogue, blaring ovens, metal, stainless steel, bodies bumping into each other, frayed nerves, and cursing. For a few seconds, he thought he had completely lost control. But that was nothing compared to what would happen over the next few years. Then came episodes crafted like stage plays, impossible continuous takes, actors putting themselves in danger inside actual kitchens, Hollywood stars working for pennies, fierce criticism, historic awards, and a level of pressure so massive it threatened the very future of the show. For those who don't know, this story is way more intense than I ever imagined, because The Bear started out as a personal project meant to explore its creator's own trauma, but it ended up becoming one of the most beloved, acclaimed, and divisive shows on modern television. If you're a fan of The Bear, I recommend putting this video up on your TV and getting comfortable. This is the story of a creator who set out to show people trapped by their obsession with perfection and ended up trapped by the exact same problem. To understand how The Bear was born, you first have to step into the mental kitchen of its creator, Christopher Storer. Today he's a celebrated director, writer, and producer, but for years he kind of just orbited other people's projects. He had worked alongside comedian Bo Burnham, produced the movie 8th Grade, and directed the series Ramy, where he was already showing off what would become his trademark: broken characters, awkward humor, and emotions constantly on the verge of a breakdown. The problem was that, even though every project turned heads, none of them felt entirely his own. Storer wanted to tell a personal story, even if the process ended up hurting more than a knife cut. Every time he flew back from Los Angeles, he would end up at Mr. Beef, a small sandwich joint run by his childhood friend Chris Zucchero. He had spent a good chunk of his youth there, watching exhausted servers, cooks passed out on tables during their few spare minutes, and workers so consumed by the clock that by the time their shift ended, they barely knew what day it was. The kitchen operated like a machine of permanent anxiety, chaos, yelling, speed, and impossible perfection. Still, Mr. Beef had always been his sanctuary. He and his sister Courtney grew up in a broken home, dealing with mental illness and addiction. They both found a real family at the restaurant. A dysfunctional one, sure, but a family nonetheless. And it inspired them to get into cooking. Courtney actually made it happen and became a chef. Storer quickly realized he wasn't cut out to survive behind the line, but he found another way to process all that chaos out in Hollywood. Then, in 2021, he found a way to bring those two worlds together. During a visit to Mr. Beef, he could barely get a word in with Zucchero, who was too busy managing the staff and putting out the usual daily fires. Watching him work, Storer realized there was a story right there waiting to be told. When they finally got a second to talk, he told him he wanted to write something inspired by the restaurant. Zucchero smirked, hesitated, and sarcastically replied, "I don't believe you." But Storer wasn't lying, and as soon as he left the restaurant, he started writing. He didn't want to tell a story about celebrity chefs, but rather about broken people trying to function under intense pressure. He also wanted to talk about himself, the anxiety he'd been carrying for years and the constant fear he lived with. Shortly after, a piece of news shook him even more. An old friend had made a devastating decision. That confusion and guilt ultimately fueled the project, which he titled The Bear. The main character is Carmy, a brilliant chef forced to walk away from the culinary elite to take over his family's restaurant. He immediately clashes with the staff and the terrible condition of the place, all while dealing with grief, massive debt, and a mind on the verge of a total breakdown. Storer originally envisioned The Bear as a feature film script. He showed the material to Courtney and other chefs he knew, hoping to work their notes into the next draft. They all told him the exact same thing. 2 hours wouldn't be nearly enough to capture the daily hell they went through. He knew they were right, so he reworked the idea into a television series. Storer now had a deeply personal project on his hands, but it was time for the hardest part. He had to convince Hollywood to let him cook. How could you possibly sell a show about cooks on the verge of a breakdown? Storer was well aware that television was in a golden age, but he also understood an uncomfortable truth. Hollywood didn't usually get excited about small, chaotic, and deeply human stories. Even so, he tapped into his network, and in March 2021, he walked into the FX offices. He knew the network well, since they had produced Ramy, and he trusted their track record of backing creator-driven projects. And he wasn't wrong. Right in that first meeting, the Fox executives were blown away by Storer's pitch and his raw, unflinching vision. The creator also explained that he pictured a first season of just 8 episodes and even laid out his ultimate plan, wrapping up the entire story in 4 seasons. The executives nodded along, but they didn't give him the green light just yet. They wanted to see a glimpse of what The Bear could be first, so they went with a classic television model. a pilot. If they liked it, they would approve the other 7 episodes. If not, the whole thing would end right there. Storer agreed, but the executives brought up another issue. He wasn't going to be able to do it alone. Even though he had experience as a producer and writer, Storer had never run a series this personal and ambitious. Because of that, they wanted to make sure he had the support of a more experienced team. So they suggested Joanna Kalo, who was coming off writing and producing hits like BoJack Horseman and Hacks. Storer admired her, but he wondered how they would actually work together, especially on a project that had become so deeply personal. He could easily end up facing the exact same culture clash as Carmy did with the restaurant staff. But all those doubts vanished the moment they met for the first time. Kalo understood that the true heart of the bear wasn't the kitchen. It was family trauma. With that in mind, she pitched a framework to adapt the project into an episodic television structure. For the first time, Storer felt like someone else understood exactly the kind of show he had in his head. Now, he had to find that exact same thing with the cast. To bring the bear to life, the director wasn't looking for A-listers, and he couldn't have afforded them anyway. FX had given him a $2 million budget for the pilot, a pretty modest number even for TV, but he wasn't interested in rounding up celebrities. He wanted actors who could convey real humanity in the middle of the chaos, exhaustion, and constant pressure of a working kitchen. But before casting a single role, he had to nail down the most important character of all, the restaurant itself. If he was going to tell a story about a place like Mr. Beef, he figured it made perfect sense to just film it right there. He reached out to Zucchero and reminded him about his idea to make a project based on the shop. His old friend remembered brushing him off back then, so he just laughed and told Storer he could use the space for whatever he needed. Storer already had the main star of The Bear, but to bring the show to life, he needed actual flesh and blood actors. Finding the right Carmy was going to be crucial, since he would be the soul of the project, and he only had one person in mind: Jeremy Allen White. At the time, he was best known for the series Shameless, where he played Lip Gallagher, a member of a heavily dysfunctional family. After 11 seasons, the actor was left in a fragile emotional state, and he even questioned where his career would go next. He had worked with Storer on the movie The Rental, and as soon as he heard this new pitch, he thought it sounded interesting. But White had his doubts. He was trying to get away from a character as unstable as Gallagher, and now he was being offered one that was even more complex. But then, he read the script and felt that Carmy was different. Someone consumed by anxiety, grief, and an absolute obsession with perfection. Plus, he was fascinated by the culinary world, even though he practically didn't know how to cook. Storer promised him intensive training and eventually won him over. The team had their lead for The Bear, but they knew the supporting cast would be just as important, especially Richie Jaramovich, Carmy's cousin, manager of the Beef, and a born loser. Then came Ebon Moss-Bachrach, an actor who had spent over 20 years playing supporting roles without ever really breaking out. When the director interviewed him, he admitted he never went looking for the spotlight. He just gave it everything he had on stage or on camera, and that was it. Storer loved that mindset, seeing it as the perfect fit for Richie. Another crucial character was Sydney Adamu, a fresh rookie chef who joins the restaurant to help Carmy. Storer gave the role to Ayo Edebiri, a writer and stand-up comedian he had worked with on previous projects. He knew right away that she could become the emotional heart of the series. That's how the director started putting together a group that didn't feel like actors at all, but rather real people just trying to survive inside a kitchen. Now he was ready to film the pilot, but if he wanted to get at least one full season made, he couldn't afford to fail. Today, The Bear is a massive cultural phenomenon, but in the beginning, everything rested on that single episode. If the executives didn't like it, it would be over. Production on the pilot, titled System, took place in July 2021, and for Storer, it was entirely new territory. On day one, he had his cast and crew inside Mr. Beef, the place where he grew up. Even though he already had TV experience, this was the first time he felt completely exposed. The pressure was non-stop, and he had to prove that all this chaos could actually work as a show. The first major challenge was directing the actors. They couldn't just look like cooks, they had to actually cook. Storer wanted quick movements, genuine exhaustion, and stress that bled right through the screen. Before cameras rolled, he made sure White, Edebiri, and a good chunk of the cast took culinary classes. He noticed that White, in particular, became obsessed with getting better. He went from not knowing how to cook at all to surprising everyone with elaborate dishes. Edebiri wasn't far behind, and pretty soon they were competing like real professional chefs. That naturally built the chemistry between them, and eventually with Bachrach too. To make sure the culinary skills stayed consistent on set, Storer brought in Courtney to design the kitchen dynamics. She oversaw everything from how the actors handled their knives to building the fictional menu. But the director quickly ran into the pilot's biggest enemy, the space itself. The Mr. Beef kitchen was tiny, cramped, and suffocating, even for the crew. There was barely any room for cameras, lights, and mics. When Storer yelled action for the first time, it turned into a massive jumble of actors screaming, overlapping dialogue, metal, stainless steel, blasting ovens, roaring industrial vents, bodies bumping into each other, genuine nerves, and swearing. For a few seconds, he thought he had completely lost control, but then it clicked. The actual discomfort of filming was exactly the energy the show needed. After all, he didn't want the audience to just look at a kitchen. They needed to feel trapped inside of it. After physically and mentally exhausting days, Storer and his crew wrapped filming on the pilot for The Bear, leaving Mr. Beef without a single scratch so Zucchero and his team could keep working. Afterward, the director locked himself in the editing bay to finish shaping that controlled chaos, amplifying the atmosphere with tracks like Pearl Jam's Animal. Storer felt like the pilot successfully captured his vision, but now he had to see what the executives at FX would think. He went into a meeting to screen the footage for them, and as soon as the end credits rolled, everyone looked like they had just been hit by a truck. The director didn't know if that was a good thing or the exact opposite. He pictured requests for new takes, a completely different edit, or even a flat-out no. But then the executives started smiling. They said they were totally captivated by the energy, the hyper-realism, the cinematic power, White's magnetism, and the way the story and characters were thrown right into the middle of the action. It was a huge contrast to typical television pilots, which tend to be slow and heavy on exposition. A few days later, Storer got the green light to finish the rest of the episodes. The Bear was officially on its way to becoming a full series, and without even realizing it, Storer had just sparked one of the most important television stories of the decade. But would that actually be a good thing? How was he going to keep up the pilot's intensity for an entire season? Even though they believed in the project, FX set a tight schedule and a budget of around $2 to $3.5 million per episode. Storer knew there was zero room for error, so he locked himself away with Kalo to finish the remaining 7 scripts. As they wrote, they both realized something important. The Bear couldn't just rely on the chaos of the kitchen. They also needed the characters to emotionally survive that hell. That's why Carmy keeps trying to modernize the business, even while carrying the grief of his brother and battling his own anxiety attacks. Meanwhile, Richie fights against the restaurant's new direction and hits rock bottom. As for Sid, she finds her place in the restaurant, right up until she clashes with Carmy and quits. The director would also add flashbacks featuring Michael, Carmy's late brother, played by John Bernthal. Storer was thrilled and convinced he could reach his 4-season goal, but Kalo reminded him that he needed to be just as realistic as the tone of the show itself. He knew the streaming world was unpredictable. Platforms were constantly canceling shows, even critically acclaimed ones. So he and Kalo made a crucial decision. The first season also had to work as a potential series finale. That's how the episode Braciole was born, where Carmy discovers the cash Michael hid inside the tomato cans and finds a way to rebuild the restaurant under a new name, The Bear. It was a hopeful ending, just in case they never got to keep going. While Storer was writing the entire season, the cast kept preparing obsessively. White was ready to keep exploring Carmy's inner demons, along with his culinary skills. He picked up his cooking classes again, and soon he was sent to work undercover at Pacioli, a Michelin-starred restaurant in Los Angeles. He thought he had practiced enough to show off, but he was dead wrong. The sheer pressure, the speed, and the yelling of a real high-end kitchen triggered the worst anxiety attack of his life. But he would use that exact feeling to bring real authenticity to his character's panic attacks. Edebiri went through a similar training process, though she specifically focused on studying the place of female chefs in the culinary world. She quickly realized they were just as undervalued as women in the entertainment industry. Bachrach, for his part, ended up falling in love with Richie and took the character way further than he had ever imagined. Storer had the scripts and a deeply committed cast, but the biggest problem was still the restaurant. Filming inside the actual Mr. Beef had been helpful for the pilot, but it was also chaotic and incredibly cramped. And there was another issue. Working out of there for weeks would force Zucchero to close his doors to the public for a long time, which meant losing a lot of money. Not wanting to keep taking advantage of his friend, the director talked to the art department, and they came up with a solution, recreating the kitchen in a much more controlled environment. The crew replicated every single detail of the restaurant at a new location, even hiding lights directly inside the set, so the cameras and actors could move around freely. Even with all that care, nothing was easy. Storer directed a few episodes and Kalo handled others, but he specifically wanted to take charge of the 7th one, titled Review. In this one, an online order glitch turns the restaurant into an absolute nightmare. Just 2 weeks before filming, Storer and Kalo realized that doing it the traditional way would ruin the experience. They needed to give the audience zero time to breathe. So they made a drastic choice, turning it into a simulated continuous take. The director spent days rehearsing with the cast, almost as if they were staging a play. Cameras, actors, and crew members had to move with absolute precision inside incredibly tight spaces, all while dealing with screaming, blaring ovens, and plates flying everywhere. The result was one of the most stressful episodes in television history. After weeks of intense work, Storer and his team wrapped the first season of The Bear, which, at the time, could have been their only one. Everyone involved was thrilled with the 8 episodes, but how would audiences react to such an unconventional and raw concept? The show hit Hulu on June 23, 2022. Storer was proud of his project, but he wasn't expecting a massive hit. It was summer in the US, a season totally dominated by huge franchises and safe content, while his baby was still a small, deeply personal, and pretty uncomfortable story. For the first few days, it seemed destined to get buried under the endless mountain of streaming options. And then, a miracle happened. Storer started getting calls from FX and Hulu telling him that The Bear's viewership was actually climbing. He checked social media and saw the word-of-mouth effect in real time. More and more people were talking about this weird show about burned-out cooks, family trauma, and constant screaming inside a claustrophobic kitchen. Critics jumped on board right away too, praising its hyper-realism, relentless intensity, and incredible performances. Suddenly, Storer realized that The Bear was dominating the cultural conversation. That success quickly carried over into awards season, where it won 10 Emmys and swept several other ceremonies. A huge chunk of the recognition went to Ayo Edebiri and Bachrach, with a lot of people already calling them Hollywood's newest stars. But the impact of The Bear ran much deeper. Storer read comments from chefs and line cooks who literally had to pause episodes because every single frame felt way too close to what they went through on a daily basis. It also sparked massive conversations about the toxicity, addiction, verbal abuse, and PTSD that run rampant in real-world restaurant kitchens. In the midst of the show's growing success, Storer didn't forget about Mr. Beef, the place where it all started. He was actually about to call Zucchero, but his friend beat him to it, calling to tell him he couldn't even keep up with the rush. Thanks to the series, sales had skyrocketed to levels he never could have imagined. He said there were lines packed with tourists and influencers, waiting for hours just to get their hands on an Italian beef sandwich. Christopher Storer had finally achieved exactly what he always wanted, to create something deeply personal that resonated with millions of people. But all of this was really just the beginning. A month after the premiere, FX renewed The Bear for a second season, and that's when the real problems began, as the anxiety from the kitchen bled right through the screen and became reality. The first season of The Bear had been an unexpected hit, and now they had to prove it wasn't just a fluke or a passing trend. When he met with FX and Hulu again, the director got some major news. He'd have a bigger budget, more freedom, and the chance to film in new locations. It was exactly what any creator would ask for, and it also meant a massive amount of pressure. His first responsibility was to avoid falling into a comfort zone. He got together with Kalo and pitched ideas he'd originally come up with as part of his 4-season plan. The first season had been about grief and survival, and the second would be about the actual birth of The Bear as a restaurant. But he wasn't going to dedicate just a single episode to that. He envisioned 10 episodes focused entirely on how Carmy and the crew built their new culinary venture, from figuring out the new menu to dealing with construction issues, all while the characters try to adapt to something completely new. Meanwhile, Carmy would find himself torn between work and an old flame. Sid tries to balance her job with her family life, and the tough guy Richie begins a deeply personal transformation. Storer was excited about the new scripts, but he had also created more characters. If he wanted performances as vibrant as those from the core cast, he needed to find the right actors. At first, he was going to stick to his rule of finding lesser-known faces for the sake of authenticity, until he found out that all of Hollywood wanted in. Among them were Olivia Colman, Will Poulter, and Bob Odenkirk. But no one was more passionate than Jamie Lee Curtis. The director met with her, and she praised him for portraying family trauma and mental health in such an honest way. He couldn't resist giving her the role of Donna, Carmy's unstable mother. Both Curtis and the rest of the big-name stars agreed to take massive pay cuts just to be part of the show. With the scripts ready and the actors thrilled to be there, Storer and his crew worked on the second season of The Bear between February and April 2023. They no longer had to fight just for the show to exist. Now, it was all about chasing perfection. Thanks to the bigger budget, this time they built new sets and got permits to film in real Chicago locations. And the director didn't just stay in the US. For the 4th episode, Honeydew, they were able to travel to Copenhagen, Denmark. Storer had more locations to work with, and he could have easily kept filming with the same visual anxiety of the first season, but he didn't want the show to become repetitive or a parody of itself. Because of that, he went for a calmer, more meditative vibe. He really leaned into this in episode 7, Forks, where Richie discovers an unexpected sense of belonging while working at a high-end restaurant. But no episode of the second season pushed Storer and his team quite like the sixth one, Fishes. It depicted a Berzatto family Christmas dinner 5 years prior to the main storyline, and it quickly turned into one of the most chaotic experiences of the entire production. Storer wanted it to feel unpredictable, just like the rest of the show, even though, behind the scenes, everything relied on obsessive precision. The audience needed to experience the sheer intensity and brutality of family trauma in a way rarely seen on TV. To pull this off, he rigged a real house with cameras and mics to capture overlapping arguments, screaming, and constant emotional outbursts. On top of that, he allowed the actors to improvise certain moments to make things even more unpredictable. And that set the stage for a truly legendary scene. Before filming the climax at the dinner table, Bernthal asked Storer for permission to go absolutely crazy when Michael blows up at Uncle Lee, Odenkirk's character. The director wondered what exactly he meant by go crazy, but he agreed and started rolling. The script just called for them to get into a screaming match and throw forks at each other. But Bernthal took it a step further and flipped the table. That could have easily brought production to a halt, but the director and the rest of the cast just kept going. The scene was pure gold. After 3 exhausting months, Storer and his crew wrapped production on the second season of The Bear. The Hulu executives were blown away by the 10 episodes and hoped the audience would feel the exact same way. And when it premiered on June 22, 2023, there was no doubt about it. The second season of The Bear became the most watched season premiere in Hulu history. Both the press and the viewers agreed that this wasn't just a regular show. It was pure art. They loved every single episode, though they definitely agreed that Fishes was one of the most stressful experiences in modern television. Storer was happy, but more than anything, he was relieved. He had pushed The Bear to its absolute limits, and he proved that people still had the stomach to watch characters overflowing with conflict. He shared his thoughts with Zucchero, who was still riding high. Mr. Beef went from selling 300 sandwiches a day to 800. And the lines of tourists and influencers were practically endless. After 2 acclaimed seasons, The Bear was one of the most prestigious shows on television. And that brought an unprecedented amount of pressure on its creator, rivaling Carmy's own. The truth is, the downside of creative freedom is the massive pressure that comes with it. And he was a perfectionist. For the first time, he felt like the audience expected absolute perfection. And amidst anxiety attacks, just like his protagonists, he figured out the core theme for the 3rd season. So, along with Kalo, he developed a new batch of 10 episodes, exploring how the obsession with excellence was slowly tearing the characters apart. Carmy becomes obsessed with earning a Michelin star, which creates tension with Sid, who is tempted by a rival chef to join another venture. Meanwhile, Richie keeps growing both as a person and as a professional, even if he still occasionally ends up trading blows with Carmy. But the biggest shift was visual. Storer would continue to move away from the frantic tone of the early days. To really explore the character's psychology, the show needed a more intimate and contemplative visual approach, with more carefully crafted cinematography. He believed it was a natural evolution that fit exactly where the characters were in their journey, although he would later find out it wasn't going to be everyone's cup of tea. But before he could move forward with production, Storer ran into a problem he knew was coming. His leads had become famous, and Hollywood was calling them for all kinds of projects. White starred in the sports drama The Iron Claw and was getting ready to play Bruce Springsteen in Springsteen Deliver Me From Nowhere, on top of becoming the face of brands like Calvin Klein. Edebiri was working on Disney movies and other series, while Bachrach got cast as Ben Grimm, aka The Thing, in Fantastic Four: First Steps. The director brought the situation to FX, where the executives were definitely concerned. Everyone knew that if they delayed production for a year or two, they would lose their momentum. Plus, the actors' schedules were only going to get tighter. Suddenly, despite all its massive success, The Bear was in jeopardy. So the executives made an extreme decision. To avoid scheduling conflicts with the cast, it would be best to film the 3rd season, back-to-back with a huge chunk of the 4th. The director was worried about this new challenge. Getting the new scripts together had been an incredibly stressful process, and he couldn't even imagine thinking about a 4th season right then. But when he broke the news to Kalo White and the rest of the team, they all said, "Yes, chef." And he had no choice but to get cooking. Filming for the 3rd season and part of the 4th kicked off in February 2024, and it quickly turned into a massive logistical puzzle. The production schedule had to be built in blocks, completely based on when the main stars were actually available. But just like his characters, Storer focused on finding perfection right in the middle of the chaos. He quickly learned to make the most out of every single second that didn't involve the core cast, designing subplots and episodes that gave a lot more spotlight to the supporting characters. That's how he brought back familiar faces like Michael and Donna, who got to show their most vulnerable side in Episode 8, Ice Chips. Storer's energy and dedication rubbed off on everyone. And the main cast, despite their new superstar status, remained incredibly collaborative. White, Edebiri, and Bachrach had to film scenes for seasons 3 and 4 simultaneously. They had to jump back and forth between scripts, all in a single day. Despite the exhaustion, they never complained. Edebiri even found the time to step behind the camera to direct Episode 6, Napkins. Backed by a crew just as focused as he was, Storer wrapped production on the 3rd season of The Bear, and part of the 4th, let's not forget, in June 2024. He immediately received praise from the FX executives, but as always, the audience would have the final say. And on June 26th, The Bear once again dominated the cultural conversation, awards shows, and social media. Plenty of critics were still calling it a masterpiece of modern television. But this time, Storer found that there was no real consensus. A large chunk of the audience and critics felt the pacing was too slow, pointing out that the heavy focus on contemplation and symbolism was pushing out the wild, frantic energy of the early episodes. Some even said the show was starting to feel more concerned with being prestigious than visceral. A few even went as far as calling it boring. Storer didn't quite know what to make of it. He had to wonder if The Bear was simply evolving, or if it was starting to get trapped in the exact same obsession with perfection it had always portrayed. And they still had to film the rest of the 4th season. The director already had 6 episodes of the 4th season filmed at the same time as the 3rd, including Episode 7, Bears. However, he couldn't just ignore the recent criticism. He reviewed the footage and held his head in his hands. The scenes were good, even powerful, but they didn't quite fit the emotional direction he had in mind for the show. And at the same time, he was afraid they would spark another wave of negative feedback. Wasting no time, Storer got together with Kalo and the other writers to rewrite the entire 4th season. The new episodes needed to fill in the narrative gaps and make everything connect. This time, the core idea became clear pretty fast. Carmy had to face the exact same problem that was haunting his creator. His obsession with perfection was no longer driving him, it was consuming him. Because of that, the chef tries to connect with the world outside the kitchen, even deciding to leave The Bear altogether. At the same time, Sid would continue weighing whether to take another job offer, and Richie finally reaches true maturity. Because of these unexpected changes, filming for the 4th season couldn't resume until February 2025, and FX had already set the premiere date for June 25th of that year. Storer and his team had to work fast. The director was determined to keep leaning into a more contemplative and thoughtful style, light years away from the absolute madness of the early days. Even though the pressure rivaled what Carmy and his crew went through, Storer and the cast managed to finish the 4th season of The Bear on time. But when it premiered, things got complicated all over again. A portion of the fanbase and the press appreciated the maturity of the plot and the characters. The praise went mostly to the actors, starting with White and Edebiri. However, the director also noticed that a huge chunk of the audience and the media felt very differently. In articles and message boards, people were saying the show had become repetitive and pretentious, and that it had lost its intensity and direction. As always, the harshest takes came from social media. People were no longer saying, "This is the show you have to watch," but rather, "Is anyone even still watching this?" Storer accepted that both sides could be right. After all, The Bear had always been about broken people trying to achieve an impossible standard of perfection, but he just wasn't ready to take on any more seasons. The Bear could have gone out on top, but that didn't happen. After the 4th season premiered, the director received congratulations from the entire team. But even with all the pats on the back, Storer still wasn't satisfied. He knew he could keep going. FX wanted to keep going. Hulu wanted to keep going. And the audience, even though they were divided, was still watching. But he also understood that dragging The Bear out too long could end up destroying the exact thing that made it special. The show had already been accused of becoming slower, more pretentious, and too in love with its own prestige. If it continued, it ran the risk of turning into the exact thing Carmy always feared, a restaurant that looks perfect on the outside but is empty on the inside. Even so, he needed to prove that he hadn't gotten caught in his own trap. So he made a crucial decision. The 5th season would be the last, and it wouldn't just focus on the future of the restaurant. It had to show the reality, the true cost of getting there. Greenlighting this final chapter triggered the director's worst fears. The Bear had turned into a global franchise, surrounded by awards, massive expectations, and constant pressure. The more prestigious and successful it became, the harder it seemed to hold on to the rawness, spontaneity, and desperation that made it unique in the first place. Storer admitted he had even lost touch with Zucchero and Mr. Beef. the true inspiration behind it all. Wanting to capture some of that original grit, he mapped out the final scripts. That's when Bachrach and Jon Bernthal approached him with an idea to write a few scenes for Richie and Michael. The director could have easily turned them down. After all, The Bear was too big of a show by then to be improvising, but that was exactly why he said yes. He asked them if they would be willing to secretly write a standalone road trip episode. He told them to think of it as an intimate western. Two men entering an unfamiliar town to leave something behind, only to end up carrying back much more than they went to deliver. The shoot would be entirely confidential, and the release a total surprise. That's how Gary was born, an unexpected episode about Richie and Michael on a road trip to Gary, Indiana, years before the main events of the show. The unannounced release and its mysterious cliffhanger worked as the perfect teaser to revive interest for those who still remembered the first season, but it also sent the crew's anxiety through the roof. For Storer, directing Gary was a way to return to the beginning, to the pain, the awkwardness, and the chaos that made The Bear feel so alive before it became a prestigious piece of work. But it also reminded him that he couldn't wrap up the series just by looking back. The fifth season had to look forward, even if it was just to say goodbye. And that goodbye will arrive on June 25th, 2026, with 8 final episodes. Carmy will have to face the possibility that stepping away from the kitchen isn't a defeat, but rather the first honest decision of his life. Sydney will have to decide if she can truly become a leader. Richie will have to prove if his transformation was real. And Storer will have to accept that, sometimes, perfection is the journey, not the destination. The Bear is about to turn off the stoves for good. Will they be able to survive their own success and come out unscathed? Or will the restaurant end up consuming everyone in its final breath? Let me know your opinion in the comments. Supergirl is doomed to fail. There are characters who fail once and disappear, and then there's Supergirl.